Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be joining you from beautiful Larrakia country, and I give my respects to elders and particularly respects to all of the First Nations strong leaders, strong voices and elders who are gathered here together. I think it gives many of us strength to be together with you and to see your leadership, so thank you. I wanted to start by reflecting a little bit on my own housing journey of growing up. For those of you who know me, you know that I was born in eastern Indonesia. Since before I was born, my parents were working with small minority language groups in eastern Indonesia. They are still there, still doing that work. And eastern Indonesia, like the Northern Territory, is one of the most linguistically rich and diverse places in the world. But what that meant for me growing up was that until I was 9, most of my nights were spent in a house that had a dirt floor, had bamboo walls, had a thatched roof, had no running water, no electricity. And so every morning, my younger brother and I's job was to walk to the river and carry at least 2 buckets of water back to the house before we were allowed to start our breakfast. But I raise that for a few reasons. And one is that I often think about, and I continue to visit and connect with my friends and extended family in Indonesia, but I often think about the fact that even though many of my friends there are living technically below the poverty line, they have never once gone to bed worried about housing stability. They know that they have a house. They know that they have control over their land. They know that they can shift their house to an appropriate place. They never have to put their cultural obligations, the maintenance of their cultural systems, the maintenance of their language as a trade-off with housing. And to add another perspective, it's also incredible in terms of the social cohesion that comes when people can live in the right place on the right country. Where there's conflict, people can move and can re-establish a new house in the right place to help minimize conflict. The right groups of people, the right families are living together, and that allows for languages and cultures to be strong. We have removed that option for so many of our First Nations people here in Australia. The second reflection that comes to me from thinking back to the house where I grew up is visiting 20 years later, 25 years later. And that village, which, like I described, had no roads, no electricity, no cement buildings, within the space of 20 years had shifted, and the majority of the houses were Bessa brick, cement floor, there was electricity, there was mobile phone reception. Now, whether or not mobile phone reception is a good thing, we can talk about separately. But the point being that in the space of 20 years, tens of thousands of houses were built and shifted. The road infrastructure, the schooling infrastructure, the health clinic infrastructure was all built. And this is just literally 1,000 kilometers north of us. We have a developing country who has outperformed us in every single way in terms of providing housing for their minority First Nations people groups. It's an embarrassment to us as Australia when we look at what other countries with less resources have been able to do. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about us here in the Territory, particularly our legal system. I could speak at length about housing as a social determinant, the way that housing instability, overcrowding, a person being homeless or without stable housing directly leads to interactions with the criminal justice system and our legal system more generally. But instead, I want to focus on 4 areas of law where every single day, probably right now as we speak, there are lawyers in court making submissions to judges directly about housing-related matters. And give you some examples about a system that is incoherent, different departments within the Northern Territory government operating at odds with each other and inconsistently with each other, legislation that is not fit for purpose, and a difficult issue that I'll come back to at the end, which is the way that our legal system forces an organisation like NAAJA, which is providing legal representation to nearly 20,000 Aboriginal people every year, forces our lawyers into doing things that are often inconsistent with the principles of community control. And so that will be the point that we'll circle back to, the legal system and the way that it undermines community control. The 4 areas that I'm going to speak on: bail, prison release, child protection, and tenancy. And for the lawyers in the room, you'll note that I've chosen 2 criminal and 2 civil topics so that none of the NAAJA lawyers can accuse me of favouritism. So turning to bail. Section 24 of the Bail Act says that one of the primary considerations a judge needs to think about in giving bail, so this is a person who has been arrested, police have decided that they're not going to let the person go back home or back into the community. Now it's up to the judge to decide whether the person goes back home, back into the community, while they wait for their court matter to finish. And Section 24 says the judge must think about the person's background and community ties as indicated by the history and details of the person's residence. What a white fella way to think about background and community ties as the history of your residence as the primary factor of talking about community ties. A number of years ago, only 3 or 4 years ago, I led a legislative review report commissioned by the Aboriginal Justice Unit, looking at elements of discrimination within 4 pieces of legislation, including the Bail Act, the Northern Territory Bail Act. As part of that, we reviewed 15,000 bail decisions stemming from 5 years. And once we accounted for a person's prior criminal history, the amount of times they'd gone into jail before, what they were charged with, previous instances of DV, what we found, and the evidence was quite overwhelming, was that an Aboriginal person with exactly the same set of criminal charges and criminal history was 2.0 times more likely to be refused bail than a non-Aboriginal person. Same charges, same criminal history, but double the likelihood of being refused bail. Now, one of the things that the courts don't keep statistics on is housing situation. So we couldn't look at the extent to which housing was contributing to that rate of bail refusals. But given that housing is one of the primary factors that the courts must consider when granting bail, we know that that would be one of the biggest distinguishing factors between a person being granted bail and not granted bail. But I want to bring it even more into focus in terms of the types of things that people have faced every day. Just this week, our housing team has been working with a mother of 2 adult children here in Darwin. The 2 children who weren't living in Darwin previously were arrested and were granted bail to the mother's residence, public housing residence. Very quickly, the mother was issued with a show cause and threatened with eviction because she had people in her house who were not on the tenancy list. And so the mother is saying to our team, I'm being forced to choose between keeping my house or kicking my kids out, which means they're in breach of bail and they go back into custody. What type of a society makes a mother choose between sending your kids to jail or keeping your house? But that's where we're at today on a regular basis. Other issues that come up with bail is the courts are, perhaps appropriately, but things do need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, very reluctant to give bail to a person when they're in close proximity to the complainant or the alleged victim. That particularly impacts people who come from remote communities. If your entire life is in that remote community, but the court says, I'm only going to give you bail if you're nowhere close to the victim, effectively that means you cannot go back to your community. Just in the news, and I only speak about this because it was in the news yesterday, we saw an example of a family, a young man from Milingimbi with no prior criminal record, arrested, and the NAAJA criminal lawyers were able to get him bail from the Supreme Court. But the only reason they were able to do that is because his entire family from Milingimbi relocated to Goulburn Island so that he could then go and live on Goulburn Island. Now, what's missing from that story is what are the impacts going to be on the community in Goulburn Island? And undoubtedly, that family is moving into already overcrowded houses, but have had to make that choice in order to get their son out of custody. One of the issues that does create tensions is that under our bail laws, there is no requirement for the court to be satisfied that the bail location where somebody is bailed to, that the owners or the leaseholders of that place actually agree or consent. So it is a very common practice for people to be granted to bail, granted to houses, when people in that house did not know, or perhaps do not agree, or did not want that person to be granted bail. But then we're back to that situation that I described before, where you're now forced to choose between allowing that person to stay at your house or them going back into custody. For a long time, homelands have served as the de facto healing centres of a broken criminal justice system. It's been very common practice for criminal lawyers to try to get clients, especially young clients, back to a homeland, because that's where they will experience healing, that's where they will reconnect with their language and culture, that's where they will resubmit themselves to the authority of elders. Increasingly, though, we are hearing from homelands residents that the burden of taking on young people with significant mental health issues, significant underlying trauma issues, and significant criminal justice issues is too much, and that it risks damaging the fabric of homelands themselves because of the consistent lack of resourcing delivered to homelands. So again, now we have Aboriginal families and communities being forced into an incredibly difficult situation. Do we say yes to taking our kids back to the homelands in the hope that this will help heal the kids and it will get them out of an incredibly violent and traumatizing detention system? Or do we say no because we risk damaging the homelands themselves because they're under-resourced? Again, First Nations people should not be having to make these choices, and yet these are the daily decisions and discussions that are happening. If I shift briefly to post-release, and there is obviously a strong connection to the tragic events in Alice Springs recently. The majority of prisoners in the Northern Territory are released without any post-release plan. They are released with no idea of where they are going to live. They are released at the nearest public transport system. So in Darwin, most prisoners are released at the Palmerston bus stop. And essentially, it is good luck, sort yourselves out, find a place to live, find a place to sleep. And again, where is the most natural place for somebody who's been dropped off at the Palmerston bus stop to find family, often family who's already on public housing, which then puts the tenancy of that family in jeopardy. Department of Corrections claim that they have no responsibility to repatriate people back to the communities in which they were arrested. So somebody might have been arrested on Groote Island, East Arnhem Land, Lajamanu. They come in, they spend 2 years in prison, and where do they get left? Palmerston bus stop. No return back to where they have their social supports. The Northern Territory has extremely high rates of what we call recidivism. That means people who have been to prison, coming out, breaking the law, and going back to prison again. 60 to 65% of people who come out of prison will not just break the law, but break the law in a way that's serious enough to go back to jail within 2 years. Imagine any other system that had a 60 to 65% failure rate. I taught at university for many years. those students would get kicked out of the program. And yet in the Northern Territory, we've just rewarded a department with a 65% failure rate with $1.7 billion in the budget. That approach is simply not good enough to say that we can release people with no post-release plan, no post-release accommodation, and somehow think that we're making the community a safer place. Another aspect in which we have government departments who don't talk or work with each other. You cannot apply for public housing while you are in prison. So let's say that you've been sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. We have a public housing wait list of 8 to 10 years. It would make sense that your name is put on the public housing wait list when you go to prison, so that 10 years later when you're released, you have housing available to you. The way the government currently works, you spend 10 years in jail, you come out, now wait for another 10 years, and then you might get housing. It's very hard to see or understand the logic of that approach. Imagine the community safety benefits if every person leaving prison actually knew where they were going to sleep the night after they left jail. We should be able to do it. We are so far off from that state. Turning next to child protection. And of course, this is in the context of some very horrific legislation that was introduced to Parliament last week. The first thing we need to look at is kinship carers. So this is where a child, an Aboriginal child, has been removed from their family because of safety concerns and put into short-term temporary care. The first step, the appropriate step, is to find somebody else within the family, within the kinship system, to take care of that child whilst work is being done with the parents or the primary carers to get them back into a state where the child can be reunified. In the Northern Territory, only 16% of Aboriginal children who have been removed from their families are placed back with kinship carers. 16%. And I wonder, does anybody in this room think that that's because Aboriginal families are not putting their hands up to look after those children? It is absolutely not because of that. Let me walk you through what it actually looks like if you're a kinship carer who wants to take an Aboriginal child who's been removed from their family. So the first issue, and these are all just the things focused on housing, is that when the department assesses a person who's put their hand up to say, I want to be a kinship carer, the first thing they check is your name on the lease of the house? If your name is not on the lease, you are not an authorised tenant, you cannot be a kinship carer. You're struck out. The second thing then that happens is they require every adult who lives in the house or spends time in the house to supply an ochre card. So imagine a house with 8, 10 adults out in a remote community. You have no justice of the peace to witness your documents. You have no identification documents easily accessible. And of course, the obligation is on the family to make the applications for ochre cards. Even if all 8 or 10 people were able to submit the application for an ochre card, it takes Safe NT 4 to 5 months to process the application for an ochre card. So how many overcrowded houses, through no fault of the people who live in that house, are going to be able to supply 8 or 10 ochre cards? Next, if you've managed to do that, the department pulls and assesses everybody in the house's criminal records. If even just one person in the house has a criminal history of a violent offence or a domestic violence order, which could relate to completely non-violent offending that has nothing to do with children, the house is deemed unsuitable for a kinship carer placement. There are currently over 6,300 active DVOs in the Northern Territory, If we compare that with ABS data, that means most likely 1 out of every 3 Aboriginal households has an active DVO. A third of all Aboriginal households are then excluded from being kinship carers. Next, the department assesses that an appropriate standard for a kinship carer is that you have to have a maximum of 2 children per bedroom. I have 5 children. I've often had 3 of my children sharing a bedroom. I think it's good for them. And yet the department would say that's unsuitable. So again, we have an overcrowded house. Nobody has their own bedroom. And yet the department says, unless you can guarantee that this child will be a maximum of 1 out of 2 children in a bedroom, you cannot be a kinship carer. So you're struck off the list again. And of course, none of these rules are published. Families cannot access this. They have no clear guidance. Instead, what happens is they fill out the 80-page kinship carer application form. They are rejected. They try again. They're rejected. They try again. They're rejected. And generally by the 5th or 6th time, understandably, people start to give up. Not because they are not competent people, not because they are not the absolutely right people to care for these children, but because they are interacting with a bureaucracy that refuses to work with them. Now that's just in relation to kinship carers. Let's think about it now from the perspective of parents or primary carers who have had a child removed from them. In this context, parents are working towards what we call reunification, to be reunified with the child who's been removed from them. Often, there are requirements set by the department. You have to do alcohol rehabilitation, you have to do anger management, you have to do mental health counselling, those types of conditions before reunification can happen. All of the things I just described for kinship carers apply equally to a parent who is seeking to reunify. Does everybody in your house supply an ochre card? Do you have anybody in your house who has a domestic violence order? How many parents will be able to meet that threshold? And again, none of that has anything to do whether or not the parent is now in a suitable place to regain contact with their child. In addition to this, one of the reasons that we commonly see why the department opposes or refuses reunification is houses in a state of disrepair. House in a state of disrepair. One example was parents from Gapawiak who had done everything else right to be reunified. They were looking forward to being reunified with their child. And the department's assessment was that the house that they were going to be reunified with their child in had a broken veranda rail and they were too close to the lake, therefore it was a safety risk. So they did not get their child back because of lack of repairing a veranda. Now, how many families in Darwin do you think live with a broken veranda? That would never impact whether or not we get to live with our children, and yet it is impacting Aboriginal parents on a daily basis. We can also think about the ridiculous economy of that type of scenario. A $5,000 veranda repair is a reason to permanently remove a child or prevent their reunification. Because we have so few kinship carers, because of what I've just described, most Aboriginal children end up in purchased out-of-home care. Residential care costs around $1.2 million a year. So a $5,000 lack of housing repair shifts into a $1.2 million per year residential care, which not only is a waste of money, but it will traumatize that child for the rest of their life. The priority housing wait list is 5 or 6 years. There is no agreement or system between which the two departments, housing and children and families, talk to each other to say if the only thing that is preventing reunification is a housing maintenance issue, Let's prioritise that so that the child can get back to their family. That fairly logical, fairly obvious conversation doesn't happen. And of course, when we look at the new legislation that's being brought in, not only is the removal and watering down of the Aboriginal child placement principle a terrible thing, the other part of this legislation is the compressed timeframes for shifting from reunification to long-term orders. So under the bill, parents will have 2 years to complete the reunification process, or else courts will be required to make long-term orders, which effectively means that that child will never go back to their parents. 2 years, and the thing that might be the difference is housing maintenance, of which you have no control over. All of these issues also impact the reunification process for home visits and overnight visits. Before parents can be reunified, the department wants to do a series of short overnight visits. But before they'll clear a child for an overnight visit, all of those things that I've just described have to be completed. So the thing that can block the overnight visit is the house is in a state of disrepair, and that is the landlord's fault. What we see here is the government places higher standards on parents to reunify than it does on the standards to take away a child. It's a one-way street. Quick to remove a child, almost impossible to get them back. I'll give you one other example. This involves an Aboriginal woman with 2 young children from a remote community who came into Darwin to escape a family violence situation. In Darwin, she was put into a tenancy program that was specifically for women and children. So the eligibility criteria was to be a mother with young children. You went into a tenancy program, you had access to a house, but you had to complete a number of courses to prove that you were a good tenant to be shifted onto longer-term public housing. When she was at that program, her partner came, used violence on her, and so the tenancy program staff made a report to DCF that the children had witnessed domestic violence. DCF removed the children. The tenancy program then said she was no longer able to participate in the program because the criteria were that you had to be a mother with children, and she no longer had children. So she was kicked out of the program, made homeless, and then DCF said, we can't reunify you with your children because you have no house. This is the level of competence that we are seeing on a daily basis. This is not fairness. And just to cap it out, kids transitioning out of care. So that child has been taken away, they've been cut off from their family, they're getting towards 18 years old. When does the department think about housing? When they're 17 and a half. They put their names down on the public housing list. Has anybody gotten a house in 6 months? And so literally, children are turning 18 and are stepping out as their first day as an adult, homeless. To shift to tenancy, and we could talk for a very long time on this particular issue, so I'll just keep it short. One of the things that we see too many examples of is simply complaints by neighbours who don't like the fact that they have Aboriginal people living next door, and will make complaints just to get those people out. We have a situation, a very problematic situation, where the Department of Housing decides that those complaints need to be referred to DCF, regardless of whether it involves a direct child safety complaint, because there's a concern about the suitability of where the child is living. So we have a racist neighbour who doesn't like the fact that they're living next to an Aboriginal family in public housing. They make a complaint that my neighbours are too noisy. Department of Housing refers that to DCF, and suddenly we kick off that whole process all over again. Again, just this week, we've been working with a tenant who had a neighbour complain and is now being threatened with eviction. The complaint was on the basis that the neighbour had asked for sugar because she had run out. And yet people live in genuine fear that these things will result in them being kicked out of their houses. Now, the very last thing, and I will wrap up, I flagged at the beginning one of the difficulties that we will need to work through with the shift to Aboriginal community-controlled housing, which we are 100% supportive of, is that increasingly what this means is that NAAJA housing lawyers will now be litigating against Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. It's an unintended consequence, and it's something that we as a broader sector will need to talk about. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.